Chapter 1. The Crimson Thread. At the Fatros Hill, basked in a cool, quiet September afternoon, the kind it was famous for, with clouds hovering as if eavesdropping on the village's gentle hum. Behind St. Anne's Church, near the cricket pitch, trestle tables stood adorned with flapping bunting, the air rich with warm scones and the faint tang of cider. The Rose Hill harvest fete had begun, drawing gardeners, bakers, retired naval officers, vicars' wives, restless teenage boys, and women from the Women's Guild. Their jams and cakes rivaled only by their sharp opinions. Under a red and cream striped tent, Miss Jane Marple sat, a dove-gray figure with a neatly pinned hat and a watchful smile. In her early 80s, her alertness remained undimmed, her knitting needles clicking slowly as her eyes roamed from face to face. Having lived in many villages, some steeped in secrets, others in tragedy, knew that the darkest truths often hid behind innocent facades. People are much the same everywhere, she often said, only dressed in different clothes. Yet, even she hadn't anticipated the shadow that would fall that afternoon, just past 2 o'clock. Scream sliced through the fate's pleasant murmur, erupting from the quilting tent. The bell ringer froze mid-swing, and silence gripped the crowd. Villagers hurried toward the sound, murmuring, peering nervously. Miss Marple didn't rush. She set down her knitting rows and moved toward the tent, her cane tapping lightly on the grass. Inside, the scene was eerily still. Mrs. Agnes Porter sat trembling near a trestle, pale as if she'd seen a specter. "There's something wrong," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the display table. There lay the Rose Hill Garden Quilt, a masterpiece crafted by the 12 women of the secretive Rose Hill Quilters Circle, each square depicting the church steeple, the old postbox, the oak on Finch Hill bore the distinct style of its maker. But now, at the quilt center, was an unfamiliar square, stark red thread on ivory, showing crossed sewing scissors, and, between them, in tiny, meticulous script, the words she knew. A cold hush enveloped the tent. Mrs. Porter clutched her chest. "That wasn't there yesterday. I locked the tent myself, who had keys." Someone asked. "Only me and Violet Green," she whispered. "But she's in London, visiting her sister." Voices rose, prank, warning, protest from a spurned quilter. Theories swirled, but Miss Marple remained silent, stepping closer to the quilt. Her fingers hovered over the crimson thread, her eyes tracing its unsettling message, already piecing together the silent secrets it stitched into Rose Hill's serene afternoon. Just above the fabric, examining the stitches, the square was expertly done woven, had sewn, it had talent and precision, but the thread, it wasn't decent shade as any other square miss. Marple said, a trembling voice beside Harriet, was Dorothy Lane, one of the younger quilters. "Do you think this means something awful?" "I think," dear said Miss Marple, quiet lifted. "Someone has chosen to speak in thread instead of words, and when Pia Plato that there's often something they're afraid to say out loud." Just then, Inspector Harold Mallory arrived, called from nearby Brenton on Felmore, a tall, severe man with a military mustache and very little time for what he called village theatrics. He dismissed the quilt square as vandalism and took only brief statements. Miss Marple, having seen this sort of man before, merely nodded pallidly and said nothing. But by that evening, when Algernon Wilmot, husband of one of the quilters, was found murdered in his drawing room with a pair of antique sewing scissors in his neck, the inspector's tone changed suddenly. The village theatrics were Veriel chapter to the scissors and the silent Seth. Rain came that night in thin, slanted sheets, tapping quietly against the tiled roofs of Rose Hill, as if to wash away the Days advanced, but no amount of water could drain away the whisper that now moved from cottage to cottage like smoke. Algernon Wilmot was dead. His wife, Clara Wilmot, had been the one to find him just after supper when he hadn't come down for his usual cup of tea. She had carried the tray up herself, muttering all the way about the way men could be so irritable when they skipped lunch. What she found in his armchair stopped her, in her traxagen eyes, wide mouth slightly parted, and the long-handled silver scissors Hellways kept in his desk drawer buried to the hilt in the side of his neck. The cup dropped, the tray clattered, and Clara let out a strangled, terrible sound, not quite a scream, not quite a sob, when Inspector Mallory returned, this time in full uniform and with a younger constable in tow. His previous intercourse to the quilt incident had vanished. The scissors had been wiped and off fingerprints. The door had been locked from the inside. A small window near the bookshelf was open just a few inches, not enough for a man to crawl through, but just now for something smaller or someone. Quick, there was no sign of forced and Trino valuables missing, and Algernon, for all his reputation as a man of sharp opinions, had been at least outwardly on good terms with nearly everyone in Rosehill. Death by Scissors, Mallory uttered grimly. You don't see that every day. In the corner of the sitting room stood Clara, clutching a lace handkerchief, her eyes puffy, her mouth trembling. I don't understand. Who would owe such a thing? We haven't had a burglary here in years. And Algy, he lazily working on his tapestry. The constable glanced at the frame by the fireplace. It was true a canvas of muted blues and browns, sat unfinished in its hoop. The beginning soft hut looked like a fox in a bramble hedge, an unlikely backdrop for violence. It was Miss Marple, who had arrived uninvited but unnoticed in the hallway, said, quietly working on a fox. Was he funny thing that Algernon Wassaways? More of a pheasant man. That's what he told me last spring at the book sale. Mallory turned to her irritation already flaring. Miss Marple, I believe that this is a police matter now. Of course, dear, she replied softly. I wouldn't dream of interfering. I was only thinking aloud. But as she stepped back onto the gravel drift, she allowed herself one small frown. The fox was wrong. The thread was wrong, and to stitching it, was hurried the next morning. The villagers' ware-boozing effect was forgotten in a jam. Stall gossip turned grim, and in the little grocery shop conversation dropped to a whisper when Clara Wilmot entered to buy eggs. Miss Marple, however, was already thinking ahead. She made a visit to the Rosehill Quilter Circle, where the women Haggader in the church hall, visibly shaken. 12 women sat in a half circle, the cups in hand. They had pulled the curtains, and no one seemed to know quite what to say. It was Mrs. Evangeline Price, the oldest among them, who broke Thislins. We should disband. This is not the time for stitching and show there's been blood. But it was just one square, Dorothy Lane said, her voice cracking. One square added by someone without permission. That doesn't mean one of us, of course. It doesn't, said Mrs. Porteret. Could have been anyone, perhaps. Someone with a grudge against Algernon, headed to have that row with the garden club last spring about the hedges. The hedges, Miss Marple said, gently stepping into the room. Oh, I do remember. He was quite insistent. They were being trimmed too low, wasn't he? The women looked up, half in surprise, half in unease. Miss Marple smiled politely. I hope I'm not intruding. I only had a thought about that square and the quilt one with the scissors. The room tensed. I was wondering, she continued, whether any of you recognized the stitching. Each of you has such distinct hands. I've watched you work for years. There is such poetry in a needle-one. It's held by a true heart silence. No one spoke but one woman, Martha Cheney, a quiet red-cheeked widow, flushed slightly and looked down at her lap. Miss Marple noticed she always did, but she said nothing more. Later, in her parlor, Miss Marple sat with a notebook open beside her. Knitting, wrote only two things: red thread, symbol, or confession. And beneath it, white stitched, She knew unless someone did outside her window. The village moved in, but inside the mystery had begun to stitch itself together, one careful thread at a time. Chapter 3. Tea and Testimonieth. Day after Algin and Wilmot's murder dawned bright and pale, with the kind off-chilled sunlight that made everything look slightly too sharp rose. Hill, normally a village that began its mornings with quiet footsteps and the smell of toast, teas, drifting from kitchen windows, now stirred. With unease, doors closed more quickly, curtains switched more often in the Rose Hill tea room, where Miss Marple had taken her breakfast almost daily for 20 years. The mood was noticeably subdued. Even the buttered crumpets seemed heavy with tension. Terrible business, murmured Mrs. Temple, the proprietor, as she poured Miss Marple's tea with shaking hands. Simply terrible, Clara. Wilmot came in earlier, wouldn't touch her biscuit, just stared at the sugar bowl like it had answers. Miss Marple stirred. Her teeth thoughtfully. Grief does peculiar things, she said quietly. It strips people of the masks they wear when all is well. Sometimes what's left beneath is instructive. Mrs. Temple blinked. You mean someone might have wanted poor Algernon dead? Miss Marple didn't reply at first. She merely looked out the window, where a group of children were kicking a ball near the war memorial. Then, she said softly, when someone dies suddenly, we must always ask, who is better off now than they were before? An hour later, Miss Marple walked a slow path to the Wellman Crescents. She carried no flowers, only her worn handbag and an old zipathicard she had found tucked into a drawer. Her visit, of course, was not one of condolence alone. Clara Wilmot answered the door in a heavy wool cardigan, her eyes rimmed with red. Oh, Miss Marple, I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm up for visitors, of course, dear. I only brought this. She handed the card gently, and I wondered, well, if you felt like a cup of tea. Talking can help, and listening to Clara's credit, she hesitated only a moment before stepping aside. The sitting room had been tidied, but Miss Marple noticed the faint impression of where Alanon's chair had been moved. The bloodstain was gone, scrubbed carefully, but there was a strange energy still in the air, a kind-of echo of the moment that had passed. Clara sat slowly on the sofa and poured out tea with trembling hands. I can't make sense of it, she said. Alga was well difficult sometimes, but he was mine 32 years, and now Miss Marple sipped her tea. You had been distant of late. Clara blinked. Who told you that? No one, said Miss Marple gently. Only the fate. You were there alone, and I noticed it hadn't come the year before. Either marriage can be a quiet strain, especially in latter years. Clara looked down, her lips pressed together. He'd become a sausage, said. Finally, with that tapestry, with things being just so, he never went out of norm. Always suspicious, always watching. You know, he once accused our gardener of poisoning the fox glowspickets. They bloomed too early. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Did he suspect? You've anything, Clara? The woman's head snapped up, startled. Then she sagged slightly. I think he suspected everyone, she said bitterly. The quilt really set him off. He said one of the squares was hiding something he wouldn't say. What? Just that. It was wrong that someone had added something meant for him. Miss Marple felt a cold flicker behind her eyes. What did he mean, do y'all think? I don't know. I thought it was nonsense. He never liked the quilting circle. Called it a coven, Miss Marple set down her cup. Clara, did you ever help with Algernon stitching? That fox pattern? No, Clara said, shaking her head. You wouldn't let me near it. Said I had too emotional a hand. Said it ruined the symmetry. Miss Marple nodded once, then reached into her handbag. She pulled out a small, folded swatch of muslin dew. You recognize this? She asked Clara Rastard. That's the same fabric as the scissor square. Yes. I asked Merce Porter for a remnant. Miss Marple said, she said it was a special batch on lift 4 of the ladies used it. You weren't one of them, of course. Clara shook her head. Miss Marple rose. Thank you, my dear. I won't trouble you further. But if you remember anything at all about that day or the days before it, might be more useful than you realize. As she stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest smile of satisfaction. Clara had lied. Not about the fabric, not about the quilt, but a booth fox. There was no way for Clara to know the tapestry was of a fox, lest seen it up close. Algernon had kept it private. Even when finished, he only revealed his designs once they were complete. And yet, Clara had spoken of it casually, as if she'd been watching every stitch, or perhaps stitched it herself. Chapter for the patchwork affirmatives. If Rose Hill had been whispering before, it was outright humming now. Wilmot murder had spread through the village like spilled ink across a white cloth. Everyone had a theory, everyone had something to say, and most of them, as Miss Marple knew all too well, had no idea what they were talking about at the Rose Hill post office and general stores. Gossip was packaged with morning papers and passed with the buttered crumpets outside the church. Parishioners murmured as they adjusted their Sunday hats, and at the Hare and Hen pub, the regulars were already speculating wildly over their afternoon pints. Miss Marple didn't participate in these discussions. She listened, and that was always more revealing. That Monday afternoon, she made her way to the Rose Hill Library, a modest stone building with flower boxes under the windows and a bell that tinkled gently. And the door opened inside. It smelled faintly of lavender, polish, and old bindings. Behind the counter sat Mr. Collins Pratt, the librarian, a shy man in his 4-0s with round glasses and a nervous laugh. Miss Marple had known him since he was a freckled schoolboy who preferred poetry to football. Good afternoon, Colin, she said kindly. I wonder if you might help me with something delicate. His eyes widened. Of course, Miss Marple, anything. She leaned in slightly. Has anyone taken out books recently on embroidery? Or she paused. Crime scene concealment? Or anything about poison, perhaps? Colin blinked. That's quite a combination, Miss Marple smiled. Yes, dear, it often is. He fumbled at the ledger well. Let me see. Oh, Mrs. Dorothy. Elaine took out symbolism and domestic need left last week. Did she now? Miss Marple murmured. And no one else? Nothing curious? Colin frowned. Actually, Algernon Wilmot himself checked out a book 2 weeks ago, The Hidden Language of Stitching. He said it was for research but looked rather disturbed. Returned it within 2 days, said it was filth, dress it up, and floss mess. Marple thanked him and left, walking slowly, the thoughts stitching themselves into patterns in her mind, symbolism, messages, and thread. She knew she passed the Wilmot house again in the way home, and noticed something new. A young woman pacing outside the garden. Gait, short, bobbed hair, fashionable. Scarf eyes, sharp and searching. Miss Marple approached. Forgive me, dear, she said gently. Eerie, looking for someone? The girl turned quickly. Oh, I'm sorry. I was justy. Didn't know if I should knock. Then, perhaps, you shouldn't, Miss Marple replied mildly. I always find that the best time to knock is when one is quite sure who or what they hope to find inside. The girl gave a small, tense laugh. You must be Miss Marple, and you must be someone with a very particular reason for standing outside a house where a man was murdered. The young woman blushed. Emily Wilmot, Algy's niece. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled just a little. From London? Emily nodded. Yes, I came as soon as I heard. I hadn't seen Uncle Algy in well years, but I used to spend summers here when I was little. I just didn't know. I felt I needed to come to pay your respects. Emily hesitated and tossed questions that Miss Marple thought was more honest than most people Menegeddon. A lifetime back in her parlor that evening, Miss Marple sat with her notebook open and her knitting beside her. She began listing names. Clara Wilmot, possibly lied about tapestry. Dorothy Elaine took out symbolism book. Quiet, nervous Emily Wilmot. Truth seeker or opportunist Martha Chinnery flinched at quilt mention Evangeline. Price wants to shut Quilting circle down. Then she added a line, if the quilt speaks. Then someone is using it to canta, soar, to frame. She tapped her pen once, twice, then added, what if Algernon knew a secret sewn into the quilt? What if he saw it too late? It was still just a theory, but in her long experience, Miss Marple had learned one thing above all: where people stitched in anger, there was always a thread of truth hidden. In the pattern, chapter 5, a stitch insolence. The morning after her conversation with Emily Wilmot, Miss Marple sat quietly on her garden bench, watching a robin hop along the edge of the flower bed. Her knitting lay untouched beside her mind. Walsallsware, specifically in the center square of a quilt, in the silence that seemed to surround it, there was something missing, not in the facts beauty, the spaces between them. She had seen it before in a courtroom once, where Alwedo had smiled, too soon after the verdict in a village fete. In Devon, where a child's tear had gone unnoticed, silence could speak, louder than shouting, when one knew how to listen. Later that morning, Miss Marple made a point to visit Martha Chinnery. Martha's cottage sat near the edge of Rose Hill, where the trees thickened in the old stone path, snarled a small sign over the gate, red thimble in thread repairs and commissions. Miss Marple knocked once and Martha opened the door a few inches, her expression guarded. She said, Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting few of us ever are, dear. Miss Marple said kindly, may I come in? I've torn a hem and thought you might be Theon too. Help. Martha hesitated, then opened the door. Of course, Camille inside the cottage smelled of lavender and cotton. The sitting room, being turned into a workshop, threads sorted by color in glass jars, pincushions piled on a shelf, and several works in progress draped over a wooden armchair. Miss Marple handed her a simple navy skirt with a small, deliberate tear near the seam as Martha examined it. Miss Marple asked gently, you've been quiet since that fete. Martha looked up, surprised. I suppose I have. It's understandable, Miss Marple continued. It was such an upsetting thing, wasn't it? That message in the quilt. Martha's hand stilled onto fabric. Yes, upsetting. You didn't recognize the stitching by any chance? Martha's eyes flicked up, then down. No, there it was again, that tiny trembled note in the voice, but in the hands, as if they knew more than the mouth would allow. Always admired your needlework, Miss Marple said. So precise, so thoughtful. You stitched the border roses, didn't you? Martha blinked. Yes, in the central square, before it was changed. Was that done by you? To Martha hesitated. It was meant to be, but I fell ill for such a week. Agnes asked Carrera Wilmot Tofu, and Miss Marple nodded, her expression soft but the square in the center. Now, she said gently, is stitched in your style. Martha went very still. After a moment, she whispered, it's not mine, but it's me. I not you to copy it. Miss Marple said nothing. She waited. Finally, Martha folded the navy skirt in her lap and looked down at her hands. I think I know who did it, she said quietly, but I can't prove it. And if I say anything without proof, Miss Marple's voice was calm, people may be hurt. Either way. Martha nodded. It's someone who was angry, not just at Gina, at all of us. She's felt excluded for years, and she's clever, too clever, always watching. Dorothy Elena, Marple asked gently. Martha hesitated again, then very slowly she nodded. I think so. She was always quiet in the circle, but when the design decisions were made, she seemed left out. She submitted a square one seat, was rejected for being too modern. She didn't take it well. Miss Marple's meant clicked through the clues to the symbolism book, Algernon's obsession with secret messages. The message she knew, perhaps, Miss Marple said softly. Square wasn't meant as a warning. Perhaps it was meant as a confession. But if so, did she know that evening Miss Marple invited Inspector Mallory to tea. The inspector, still gruff and unconvinced about quilted clues, took the scone. She offered, with a sigh, "This is a domestic murder," I insisted. "Simple. The wife, Clara, probably poisoned him first, then staged it. Seeing she had motive access. In time, Miss Marple sipped her tea and decisions in the quilt. Coincidence? And the message, coincidence?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ito, admire your commitment to coincidence, Inspector. Most people would be afraid of looking foolish." He scowled. "Well, and what precisely is your theory?" She leaned forward just slightly. "Someone in the quilting circle added that square," she said. Quietly, someone who felt betrayed, Simeon, who knew Algerine's secret and tried to reveal it in the only language Agatha felt safe using. Mallory frowned. "Secret?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but perhaps not one of his secrets." Placed the muslin sample on the table. "I believe the real question is who did he see reading the thread? And what did he threaten to expose?" As the inspector left, puzzled but troubled, Miss Marple returned to her notebook. This time she drew the quilt itself, 12 squares. One central she shaded in, 4 of them, and wrote beneath 4 women had access to the special muslin. One stitched the truth, one died for it, one remained silent. Bon is still watching. She closed the book. The silence in Rose Hill was growing louder. Chapter 6. The woman with the broken needle. The weather in Rose Hill had turned sharply colder by midweek, and with it came a change in the mood of devilage. She, as if the very wind, carried whispers too dangerous to speak aloud. The murder of Elgin and Wilmot, once a shocking anomaly, was beginning to shape daily life. Familiar routines were strained. Friendly smiles were more cautious. People were no longer just curious, they were afraid. Miss Marple, however, was not afraid. She was curious. That Thursday, she paid a visit to Dorothea Lane. Dorothy lived in a modest, semi-detached house near the allotments, a place cluttered with old lace curtains, dusted figurines, and the faint medicinal scent of camphor. It was a tidy house, too tidy, Miss Marple thought, in the way that suggests either deep loneliness or a pressing need to keep control. Dorothy answered the door with surprise, poorly concealed behind a weak smile. "Miss Marple," she said, "I wasn't expecting. No one ever is, dear." Miss Marple replied, stepping in. "I've brought you some of my gooseberry cordial. You remembered. You rather liked it." Dorothy blinked. "Oh yes, thank you." Sat in a small sitting room where a teacup had clearly been set down in haste. A bit of thread still clung to thermrest, and a sewing basket sat open at the base of the fire. Miss Marple glanced at it. "Still stitching?" "Just repairs," Dorotheus said quickly. "Nothing important. Even repairs require attentionless." Marple said lightly, "A broken seam can unravel an entire coat. I've always said, rather like secrets." Dorothea stiffened ever so slightly. "Have you managed to sleep?" Miss Marple asked softly after the news about Tolgin. And Dorothy looked down. "Not well. None of us have." "Was he ever unkind to you?" Dorothy. The woman looked up sharply. No, not really. He was curt, sometimes sharp with words." "And did you ever suspect he knew something about you?" Smithing. Private Doratha's hand trembled as she read Shetfa. Her T.I. "I don't know what you mean, Miss." Marple studied urgently. The square in the center of the quilt was stitched in a way very like your own hand, almost perfectly mimicked, but not quite. Whoever made it was trying to say something, perhaps about themselves, perhaps about someone else. Dorothea's eyes filled suddenly with tears. "I didn't do it," she whispered. "Ready, wanted to. I was so angry when they rejected my original square. I thought they were mocking me, but I didn't add the scissors. But you know who did?" Silence. Then, very slowly, Dorothy nodded. "I saw her that night, the night before the fete came out of the quilting tent, just after midnight. Couldn't sleep, So E went walking. I saw her locking the flap. Who, miss? Marple asked quietly. Dorothy hesitated. Martha Chinnery that evening. Miss Marple sat in her parlor with a notebook, her knitting untouched once more. Martha, why lie about this square? Dorothy saw her, but did she see the truth? Was the quilt a confession or a threat? She added, one more question. Was Al-Anon the intended victim at that same moment across the village? Martha Chinny was standing in her sewing room with trembling fingers, staring at a square of muslin she had hidden behind a drawer. Was nearly identical to the one in the quilt, the same crimson scissors, same delicate phrase stitched beneath them, but this one read Hinu. And just as she folded it to hide it away, she heard a sound behind her, a creak on the stair. She wasn't alone in the house. Chapter 7. A stitch too many. The sound came again, a creak slow and deliberate, rising from the old wooden staircase just beyond. The sewing room. Martha Chinny stood, frozen, the muslin square clutched tightly in her hand. Her breath, to shallow the house, was soft to be empty. She lived alone, had done for years since. Her sister, Pasadena, she always locked the front door by habit. Even in Rose Hill, a second creaked in silence. Martha tucked the muslin square into the folds of her cardigan. Her heart hammering. The room was dim, the only light coming from a small table lamp near her embroidery hoop. The scissors on her desk gleamed faintly. She picked them up, not for sewing this time, but for defense. Who's there? She called, her voice sharper than she intended. This is private property. Silence. She stepped into the hole, every floorboard under her feet, feeling like it betrayed her presence, but there was no one in the stairwell. No shadow, no figure, only the faint smell of something unfamiliar. Oil paint. Her eyes darted to the front door, still shut, still locked it back in the sewing room. She found the window ajar, just slightly. No more tana crack, but it hadn't been opened before, and a small photograph frame on the sill. A picture of her sister and herself at the Rose Hill Spring Fair had been turned face down the next morning. Miss Marple sat across from Inspector Mallory at the Hare and Hen, where he had reluctantly lingered to meet her over breakfast. I have a theory, which he began, passing him a folded sheet of paper. You usually do, he muttered, unfolding it. On the page was a diagram of the quilt, each square labeled with the initials of its maker. This, Miss Marple said, tapping the center square, was meant to be Stitched B. Martha Chinnery, but she fell ill, or so the story goes, and Clara were monitored to fill in. Yes, we've covered this, Mallory said, and now it turns out Clara may have had more reason to stab her husband than we thought. Quite, but you see, Clara didn't stitch it either. That's now confirmed. Mallory blinked. But Martha lied, Miss Marple said, calmly, not out of guilt, but out of fear. Someone else added the square, the real one, with the scissors and thin massage. She knew, no miss. Marple corrected the square she hid. Says Hinu, a different square altogether. Mallory frowned, then who placed Theon? That read she knew. That's the question, isn't it? She said. Someone wanted the message changed. Someone switched it, but not before Martha stitched her version, meaning the message she tried to send was not the one the world saw. Mallory leaned back, scowling. We're going in circles, Marple. Don't you say it softly. We're narrowing in. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Emily Wilmot, who had taken a room at the village, and the young woman looked tense, tired, but determined. I think Algernon was hiding something. She said plainly, something about one of the quilters. Something held her into too late. Miss Marple nodded. Did he ever mention an E? Emily shook her head, but he kept saying odd things in his letters last year. Things like they've stitched me into a lie. Threads. Don't forgive Millie, threads. Remember at the time, I thought it was just his way with the words. Miss Marple considered that in silence. Then she asked, when you were awkward, did Aljuna ever seem close with Martha? Emily paused. Yes, actually, I remember. He used to call her Little Mouse. But then, one year, he just stopped speaking. To her, she came to visit once, and he slammed the door in her face. Do you know why? Emily shook her head. I was too young, but my aunt clarified me years later. There had been an incident, something about a letter or maybe a will, but Clara refused to talk about it. After that night, Miss Marple, once again, sat in her parlor with her notebook open. She scribbled quickly, paused, tapping the pen. Martha knew a secret, tried to warn the village Simeon. K.L. saw the warning and changed it not to silence the truth, but to direct it. She circled a name, Dorothy, and underneath it wrote, watched Martha that night, said nothing until I asked. Playing the victim, playing the quiet tone. In one final line, perhaps, the killer isn't the one who stitched the scissors square, but the one who made sure we saw the wrong gun as the rain began to tap once more on the windows of Rose Hill. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. The threads were tangling but soon she would begin to pull them straight. Chapter 8. The whisper behind the thread. The days following Algernon Wilmot's death settled into a strange rhythm. In Rose Hill, the kind of quieted made footsteps sound louder, gossip traveled faster, and every closed curtain feel like a barrier between safety and suspiciousness. Marple had spent her morning in the garden, ostensibly trimming her roses. Though her mind was elsewhere, she had come to learn that nature, much like murder, had its seasons. Silence, growth, and eventual bloom. She had waited long enough. Just after midday, Miss Marple visited at Rose Hill Women's Guild Hall, where the Quilters' Circle was holding its first meeting since the fate. The air inside the room was taut, as if the stitches of friendship that once bound the women together had frayed the quilt. The Rose Hill Garden quilt lay folded on the table. No one wanted to touch it. I suppose we can't go forward, Mrs. Evangeline, Price said firmly. Not with that thing sitting in the center. It's just cloth, muttered Dorothy Elaine, eyes lowered. No, said Agnes Porter, her voice trembling. It isn't that square changed everything. It cursed us. Please don't be superstitious, Miss Marple said keenly from the doorway, startling them. The quilt did nothing more than what quilts have always done. It told a story, one that someone didn't want read properly. The women turned to her, most in confusion, a few in dread. What are you saying? Asked Dorothy. Miss Marple stepped inside and ran her fingers gently along the folded fabric. I'm saying someone in this room didn't just add a message to the quilt, she said calmly. They altered the messages Simeon's tried to send. They silenced a warning by changing a single word, and you became she knew. A murmur rose. That's ridiculous, said Evangeline. How would anyone even know which word came first? Miss Marple looked up, because the square stitched by Martha Chenry was never meant for the quilt. It was found in her sewing room, hidden. Its messenger read, he knew. All eyes turned to Martha, who sat near the window, pale and quiet. Miss Marple continued. She feared Algernon had discovered something, a secret tied to the group, a lie that went far back. Tried to warn you all in the only way she knew how, through thread. Simeon saw her and someone intervened. Martha whispered, I didn't tell any on Beck House. I thought it was too late. He was already dead, and I was scared of her off one. Asked Mrs. Porter. Miss Marple turned toward Dorothy Elaine. Dorothy's eyes widened. No, that's absurd. I didn't touch that quilt after the group finished it, but you were seen, Miss Marple said softly, leaving tent at midnight, locking it behind you. You said it was just a walk, that you didn't know what. Martha had added, but how could you recognize a stitch in darkness unless you were already watching her work? Dorothy's hands began to tremble. She had no right, Dorothy said. Suddenly, no right to speak for the rest of us. You mean she had no right to tell Algernon the truth, Miss Marple said. A Boothwell gasps rippled across the room. Miss Marple looked to the others. Algernon Wilmot had planned to leave a sum of money to the quilters' circle to commission a book about traditional embroidery techniques, but only under one condition, that it be led by someone unanimously upright and socially respected. He had written a private letter intended to be included in the final version of his will. Martha found it while doing reparsing a drawer in the will home. She shared it quietly, and Dorothy, who knew she would never be chosen to lead, acted, "I didn't kill him." Dorothy snapped, "No," Miss Marple said, "but you did break into the tent and switch the message back ties. You hoped that if blame fell elsewhere, especially toward Clara, the matter of the will and your jealousy would die with Algernon." A long silence followed. Then Clara Wilmot stepped slowly forward from the back of the room. Dorothy, she said softly, "You let me think I was losing my mind, that I had somehow been blamed." Dorothy looked away, her mouth a tight, bitter line. "I didn't mean to," she started, but no one believed her any more that evening. Inspector Mallory stopped by Miss Marple's cottage. "Well," he said gruffly, "looks like Will Beckerton." Dorothy, with evidence tampering and obstruction, still can't pin the actual murder on her. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "because she didn't commit it." Mallory raised her brow. "You still thinks there's more?" "Oh yes, Marple said, settling into her chair, "because if Simeone went to the trouble of changing the message, it means the original message still posed a threat, even if Hugh was already dead." She picked up her knitting. "The killer wasn't hiding from Algina." She looked up at the inspector. "They were hiding from everyone else." Chapter 9. The Needle's Shadow. Rose Hill was a village knitted together by decades of tradition, but now something was unraveling, thread by thread, person by person. The murder of Algernon Wilmot was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a mirror reflecting long-buried grievance, sesquiate betrayals, and unfinished truthsmiths. Marple knew the pattern all too well. She had seen it before in a Cornishizide town, in a Hampshire rectory, and once in a London boarding house that smelled faintly of lavender and arsenic. People rarely killed for hate alone. They killed to protect a lie. It was late in the afternoon when Miss Marple walked unhurried as ever towards the village church. Reverend Julian Massa, soft-spoken man with a receding hairline and a deep fondness for books and English flora, was arranging hymnals when she entered. Miss Marple, he said warmly, though a little cautiously, "I was just about to lock up. Oh, I won't be long, Julian. I just have a question, a delicate one." The vicar used to Miss Marple's way of delivering polite bombs, said the hymeneal aside. "Yes." Miss Marple clasped hands. "The Wilmot family, they donated rather a lot to the church in past years, didn't they?" "Yes, indeed. Particularly Algernon, though I was told to be Mrs. Wilmot that in the past year his generosity had waned." "Did he say?" "Why," Reverend Moss frowned. "Not exactly, but I remember he seemed troubled after a quilter circle event last winter, said something cryptic about truth being cut out and stitched over. I didn't understand it then." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think I do now." She thanked him and left the quiet of the old stone church echoing behind her. Meanwhile, in her small rented room at the village in, Emily Wilmot sat reading the letters her uncle had sent her over the past year. At first, they had been charming and rambling, filled with observations on the weather and needed point in various male quarrels with the villagers. With the later letters, Ginjed, there were darker phrases, underlined things like, "I fear a shadow behind the embroidery. There's a stitch missing. A story lost. Martha knows. I think she'll waste new." Emily tapped her finger against one page. Martha, always Martha. At dusk, Miss Marple sat down once more at her writing desk. The rain had returned, thin, persistent, the kind of rain that turned Rose Hill's cobbled streets to silver and made warm parlors all the more inviting. She opened her notebook, now thick with notes, and turned to a fresh page. She wrote, "Anna Martha, Chinnery, underneath, first to discover Thule created original he knew square, lied about stitching it claimed. Ill, not a confirmed, called Algernon a cruel man. In 2019, meeting noted by Mrs. Portathon, she wrote another name, Clara Wilmot, allegedly locked tent with Martha's. Kelp, inconsistent story about embroidery, claimed not to know design of Algernon's tapestry, but described K. Fox in detail would inherit. If no amendments to Algernon's will were signed, then one more Dorothy Lane tampered with quilts on Martha. The tent watched silently bought symbolism in needlework 1 month prior. Motive, jealousy, and resentment, but something was still wrong. None of them had a reason to kill Algernon before the quilt was displayed, unless, she wrote, he saw the original square before the fate he confronted Martha. He died later that day. Shunderland, it twice the timeline was wrong. Someone had seen the quilt. Earlier than anyone admitted, earlier than it was safe to see, thought night, as Miss Marple closed her curtains. Eyes rested on the distant dial of Martha. Tanner's cottage, dark and still at the edge of the village. A light flickered briefly. In an upstairs room, then vanished. Miss Marple's voice soft, as her knitting wool echoed only to herself. Martha didn't warn us, she confessed. Chapter 10. A thread in the dark night came to Rose Hill with a heavy stillness, the narrow lanes so often filled with the soft clatter of the cycles, and the familiar bark of Mr. Kenneth's terrier lay quiet under a silver sheen of rain. Every house glowed faintly from within curtains, drawn locks. Checkered-wise fear had found its way into the village. Miss Marple, however, was quite awake. She sat in her small study under the steady ticking of the clock, her notebook open, her bare spectacles perched on the end of her nose shed, lit only one lamp, enough for reading, not enough to draw attention. There was a cup of tepid tea beside her, and a scave wool untouched on the arm of her chair. 'Cause tonight Miss Marple was thinking not about the quilt, not about the square, but as about Martha Chinnery. Earlier that day, after leaving the vicar, Miss Marple had stopped discreetly at the records room in the village hall. She had asked to see committee rosters and meeting minutes from the Rose Hill Quilters Circle dating back 4 years. People were so accommodating when you were elderly and polite. The names came up again and again: Clara Wilmot, Dorothy Lane, Agnes Porter, Martha Chinnery. But in one set of notes, a winter meeting 2 years Agatha had been a correction. In the margins, MC objected to heritage motosuggers did. Its abstract piece rejected 5 to 1 another. Note: 1 year ago, MC took over bookkeeping duties after C. Wilmot withdrew due to stress, and final lip proposal Martha Chinnery to submit center square next year's heritage. Quill unanimously approved. Miss Marple had smiled faintly. Martha had waited. Martha had planned now. Under cover of night, Miss Marple stood in her doorway in her mackintosh. Her steps, like the rain, had slowed to a drizzle. She made her way to Martha's cottage. There was no light on inside. She knocked once, no answer. She knocked again, more firmly still. Nothing. Then the door creaked open. Not wide, just an inch, but enough. Miss Marple did not enter. She stood on the threshold, calm as ever. "Martha," she called softly, "are you quite well?" From the shadowed hallway came a slow, hesitant voice. "I knew you'd come." Martha appeared at the end of the corridor, her dressing gown wrapped tightly, her eyes dark with something between guilt and resignation. Miss Marple didn't move. "Why? Did you change your story, dear?" she asked Martha entrapedly. "You said you were ill, you said." Clara stitched the center square. "Beauty was always you, wasn't it?" Martha's voice trembled. "He wasn't supposed, Toady, but he did. Yes." There was a long pause between them. Miss Marple took a slow breath. "Tell me what happened, Martha. I won't ask again." Martha stepped into the dim light from the porch. porch, she looked old tonight, not in years, but in weight, the weight of a secret carried too long. He found the square. She said I hadn't stitched it into the quilt, yet it left it out, tucked in the muslin stack, meaning to wait until the last boat. Algernon was helping Clara move some things in the stoolroom, and he saw, if knew it was mine. He always recognized my hand, miss. Marple waited. He demandito know what it meant. Said I was accusing him. I tried to explain to her this. It wasn't about him personally. It was about what he represented, the corruption, the silence in the group, the favoritism. But he didn't see it that way, no. Martha said softly. He laughed. Said I'd made myself into a martyr with any doubt. Said he'd make sure no one ever listened to me again. He threatened to destroy the quilt, to accuse me of Leo slander, mental illness, and so I scared him to leave. He didn't. He got angry, said, "You'll never be more than a footnote, Martha." Her voice cracked. He turned to go, and I don't know what happened. There were scissors on the desk. I still don't remember if I meant to, if I silenced, yeah, I stabbed him. Miss Marple said, quietly. Martha nodded, and then he panicked. I wiped. Everything moved. The body to the sitting room, locked thundo, to make it look like someone had come and gone. I'd seen something like Itan, a mystery book. Once, a bitter laugh. Turns out, it's harder than it sounds. Miss Marple was silent for a long time. Then she asked, "And the quilt?" I never meant for it to be used. Martha whispered. I hid my square bed. Dorothy saw me in the tent that night. She must have suspected and share-placed it. Turned my warning into something vague, something that pointed away from me. She wanted Clara to take the fall. Martha nodded. Dorothy always hated Clara, thought she was a hypocrite with her charity work and pearls, miss. Marple looked into the woman's eyes. You've stitched beauty into so many things, Martha, but this, which is stitched too many. Martha wept quietly. At dawn, Miss Marple returned at home and phoned Inspector Mallory. By 7, Martha Skinnery had been taken into custody, not with drama, but with a quiet nod of acceptance. She confessed everything, and for the first time in weeks, the rain stopped. Chapter 11. The pattern revealed. The rain had lifted at last for the first time in many days. A shy golden sun filtered through Rose Hill's misty morning, casting soft light over slate rooftops and dew-speckled hedgebud. Even with the weather improved, a hush lingered across the village, thickened of hush that settles after a storm when things are broken, but the worst has passed. Miss Marple, having taken her breakfast at 7, precisely sat in her parlor, reading the mornings. Post. A single letter lay open beside her, from Emily Wilmot. Thank you for seeing the truth when no one else could. My uncle wasn't a kind man, but he didn't deserve to die. Misunderstood. I'll be returning to London soon. There's nothing left for me here, but I won't forget what you've done here. How you listened when no one else did. It was signed simply, Ooh. Miss Marple folded the letter, placed it under her knitting basket, and took slow sip of tea outside the village. Stirred later that morning, she found herself once again at the Women's Guild's hall, where the Rose Hill Quilters' circle had reconvened. Fewer women attended this time. Clara Wilmot was absent. Dorothea Lane had withdrawn her membership, but Mrs. Porter, Evangeline Price, and a handful of the younger members sat in a quiet semicircle. The Rose Hill Garden quilt lay, neatly folded on the table, its beauty dimmed by memory. They rose. When Miss Marple entered, "We've decided to take it apart," Mrs. Porter said solemnly. "Removed center square, perhaps. Restitch a new one. Start again, miss." Marple nodded gently. That may be wise, or perhaps leave it as it is. A reminder that even the finest craftsmanship can conceal pain. Dorothy Lane, her usual tightness gone, looked up. "Do you think we failed her?" Miss Marple paused. "I think she felt invisible, and when people go unseen for too long, their grief finds strange ways of expressing itself. She should have said something. She did." Miss Marple replied softly, but no one was listening. That afternoon, Inspector Mallory came to call. He stood awkwardly, Miss Marple's doorstep, his hat in his hands. "You were right about everything, Hess. She's confessed. No lawyer yet, but she's composed, quiet. Said she just wanted someone to see her before it was too late." Miss Marple nodded. "I don't think she was ever dangerous. Not in the usual way," she said. "But resentment, it curdles in silence, especially when a person has talent that goes unrecognized. Martha didn't kill for inheritance or revenge. She killed because her voice had been silenced too long." Mallory shifted, uncomfortable still. "She stabbed a menace," Miss Marple said, "and now she will pay as she must. But I do not think she was ever evil, only ignored." Gathered evening, Miss Marple walked to St. Anne's Church. The bells were not ringing, doors were open for quiet reflection. Inside, a single candle flickered before the altar. She sat in the last pew and let the hush wash over her. She thought of Algernon, arrogant, rigid, proud, and of Martha, insensitive, precise, wounded. She thought of Dorothy's misdirection, Clara's silence, and Thistich that had tried to speak for a soul who couldn't anymore. And she thought of Rose Hill, beautiful, tidy, deceiving. Like all villages, it had worn its charm like a lace veil over deeper truths as Miss Marple stepped back into the cool night air. A light breeze lifted the edge of her scarf. The village would move on. She knew they always did. The market would reopen. The fete would return next year. Gossip would shift to gardening contests and plum harvests. But something had changed beneath the surface. Thread had been tugged loose, and once unraveled, no pattern could ever quite go back to what it had been. Chapter 12. The last 4 weeks following Martha Chiner's confession brought a fragile calm to Rose Hill, but for Miss Marple, its mystery was far from finished. The quilt with its worn fabric and hidden messages still held secrets waiting to be uncovered. One crisp autumn afternoon, she returned to the Women's Guild Hall with the remaining members of the quilters. Circle gathered to discuss the quilt's fate. The hall was filled with quiet conversation and the faint scent of lavender and sewing thread. Mrs. Porter, looking resolute yet wistful, unfolded the quilt carefully on a large table. The center square, now removed, lay beside it, a pale fabric embroidered with crimson suzerain. The words, she knew. Miss Marple's gaze rested on the empty space. "In the quilt, it seems there is one square left unseen," she said softly. The women exchanged glances. "You mean the last square?" "Martha was supposed to stitch?" asked Evangelonopris. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "She never spoke of it, but I believe it holds definite piece of the puzzle." Dorothea Lane, who had remained silent, nodded. "Remember now, Martha once told me she planned to embroider a rose, but in a way that represented forgiveness, Miss." Marple smiled gently. A rose indeed, a symbol of healing with care. Mrs. Porter produced the last square Martha had complete for her. A rest, it was delicate, pale fabric with a single, perfect crimson rose stitched in the center, its petals unfurling with quiet grace. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "spinel stitch represents what we all need after such sorrow, a chance to forgive, to heal, and to remember." As the quilt was slowly pieced back together, the village of Rose Hill felt the weight of its secrets ease. The truth had been sewn in thread, hidden in silence, but finally revealed, and in the gentle fall of autumn leaves, life began to bloom anew. Chapter 13. Shadows beneath the surface. Though the quilt was restored, and the immediate mystery laid to rest, Marple sensed that the shadows cast by the murder lingered beneath Rose Hill's placid surface. People moved cautiously now, as if wary of stirring undercurrents of old grievances and unspoken fruits. Village continued its routines, but beneath the polite greetings and carefully arranged flower beds, subtle tensions pulsed. Miss Marple's visits became more frequent, not only to old friends but two quiet corners of the village where whispers and glances revealed more than words ever could an afternoon. While browsing the local market, she overheard two women speaking in hushed tones about a long-forgotten dispute involving the old garden Quilting, a will that had never been properly executed. Algernon's intentions were Clairon said, but some in the village stood to lose far more than a patch of land or a sum of money. Miss Marple quietly stepped closer, realizing the story was far from over that evening. She penned a note to Inspector Mallory, inviting him to join her in further inquiry. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered wider than anyone had imagined, and to find the whole truth they would have to dig beneath the surface. Chapter 14. Unearthing Old Roots. The chill of early autumn crept steadily through Rose Hill, and with it came a stirring beneath the village's serene facade. Miss Marple and Inspector Mallory had begun their quiet investigation into the chit. Whispers of old disputes and unsettled accounts. Linketta, Aljan, and Wilmot's past. Their first stop was the faded stone cottage of Mr. Harold P. Exley, the elderly man known for his meticulous records of village history and finances. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled out a collection of yellowed papers, wills, and correspondence dating back decades. Many thought Algernon was a man of integrity, K. Exley remarked, but the truth is often buried beneath layers of goodwill and silence. Other were claims made after his father's death that were never fully wrestled. Miss Marple sifted through the documents, her sharp eyes catching asseries of handwritten notes revealing contested land boundaries and secret agreements among village families. One note mentioned a previously undisclosed codicil to an old Wilmot will, one that promised a sizable inheritance to someone outside the immediate family. Mallory's brow furrowed. The scoot change everything. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. It seems the roots of this conflict stretched much deeper than the quilt or even Algernon's death. As the two continued their careful examination, the threads of greed, jealousy, and long-held grudges began to weave a complex tapestry, one that threatened to unravel. Quiet piece of Rose Hill forever. Chapter 15. Tangled Threads. Thy investigation deepened as Miss Marple and Inspector Mallory pieced together complicated history revealed in the documents from Mr. B. Exley's cottage. What had first seemed a simple case of domestic tragedy now exposed the intricate web of relationships from taunt, a teen, promises, entangled within Rose Hill's community. Marple found herself walking the village lanes, more often engaging in quiet conversations and careful observations. Each visit uncovered Anathor, thread a whispered suspicion, here an overlooked slight. Their old friends now eyed each other with measured caution, and casual acquaintances revealed subtle tension hidden beneath polite smiles. At the center of these tangled threads was the mysterious codal, a document that might have drastically altered Algernon and Wilmot's were redirecting a significant inheritance to an unexpected beneficiary. At who stood to gain and who would go to any lengths to protect their claim. As Miss Marple contemplated these questions, she felt the unmistakable weight of Askret that refused to stay buried. The final pieces of the puzzle were close at hand, and soon the truth would emerge from these shadows. Chapter 16. The final gathering. The crisp autumn air brought a renewed sense of urgency to Rose Hill. Miss Marple knew the truth was near, yet fragile as the last leaves clinging to the trees. She arranged a meeting at the village hall, inviting all those involved in the unfolding drama: Clara Wilmot, Dorothea Lane, Emily Wilmot, Mrs. Porterand, a few others whose names had surfaced in her inquiries. The room filled with a tense silence. A seat person took their seat, eyes darting and whispers trailing off abruptly. Inspector Mallory stood by the door, his expression serious but respectful. Miss Marple began gently. Wahave all carried secrets, and it is time to unravel the threads that bind. Sergeant Wilmot's death was not the end, but the beginning of truths long hidden. Known by one, she laid out the facts, the altered quilt squares, the secret code disputes over the inheritance, and the tangled resentments. Beneath Rose Hill's surface, voices rose, accusations flew, and tears fell. But amid the storm, clarity began to emerge. The true motive behind the murder was no longer a mystery. It was the desperate attempt to protect a legacy that threatened to expose far more than money or property. By the evening's end, the villagers understood that healing required honesty and courage, the final stitch in the murder. Quilt was a confession, a reckoning, and a promise that no secret could remain hidden forever. Chapter 17, Threads of Forgiveness. The dawn following the final gathering was tinged with a gentle stillness, as if Rose Hill itself was holding its breath. Villagers, having faced their hidden truths and confessed old grievance, moved cautiously toward a new beginning. Miss Marple observed from her garden, her eyes soft but attentive. Forgiveness, she knew, was the most delicate stitch in any tapestry, requiring patience, humility, and an honest heart. Clara Wilmot, having faced the loss of her husband and the revelations that followed, began to visit the quilting circle once more. This time, not as a victim, but as a woman seeking peace. Dorothy Elaine quietly stepped back from the group, choosing solitude and reflection, while Emily Wilmot prepared to leave Rose Hill, her heart lighter, bothered spirit forever changed. The quilt itself, restored and mended, came to symbolize not just the mystery and pain, but also the resilience and hope it threaded through the village's fabric. Miss Marple knew the final stitch had been sewn not in anger or fear, but in the quiet strength of forgiveness. Chapter 18, The Final Stitch. Harvest. Fate returned to Rose Hill. The following year, a little quieter, a little more thoughtful. The village green was dressed once more with bunting and stalls, the scent of fresh bread mingling with late summer blooms. Yet beneath the cheerful bustle, there lingered a new sense of understanding, a community bound not just by tradition, but by the threads of truth and reconciliation. Miss Marple stood near the quilting tent, watching as the new quilt was unveiled, a beautiful patchwork of roses, leaves, and symbols of hope stitched by many hands, each square telling a story of healing. The central square bore a single rose in crimson thread, delicate, open, and bright against the cream fabric, a final stitch symbolizing both an end and a beginning. As the villagers gathered, Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself, her sharp, catching the subtle glances exchanged the soft smiles of those who had endured much. She knew that no secret could remain hidden forever, but that the strength to face them was the greatest gift of all. And so, with the final stitch complete, Rose Hill embraced a new chapter, woven together by courage, forgiveness, and the enduring power of community.